What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at the second major patch for No Rest for the Wicked, known as The Breach. This particular update brings with it an extension of the main story, a pretty significant rework and rebalance of many existing items and abilities, new weapon types in the forms of gauntlets and wands, and a few other things worth getting into, to be sure. And this comes just about 2 weeks or so after the game's anniversary into early access, and while there was a fair bit of interest in the game, it did come with a few caveats, as performance was really rough when it launched, the actual amount of content was a bit limited, and they've obviously had to get to work on fixing those things, which is why this particular update took so very long. Now, with that in mind, I kind of want to kick this video off by talking about a sort of positive and negative. On the positive side, this particular update brought a host of performance updates and optimizations, that kind of thing, and I'm actually kind of happy to say that, for me at least, those seem to have been very effective. Having been checking this update out, I can honestly say that this game ran infinitely better for me than it had previously, which is obviously nice to see. But with that in mind, some of the things they've changed here are interesting, let's say. So, as an example, there's a boss towards the beginning of the game known as Falstead Derrick, or Duroc, I'm not exactly sure. But while they made a whole host of changes to enemies and things like that to generally try to tighten up the challenge, what I really noticed in this update is that this guy went from a boss that I absolutely destroyed to being very, very hard. So much so that I was like, I am having a bit of trouble believing that this is the same fight. So I, of course, dug through the patch notes, and sure enough, this is one of the bosses they balanced and changed, and I think they probably overdid it, as I used to destroy this guy, and now I can't even get him down to half health. And what's more, they actually tweaked and adjusted enemies across the board, so they react to you trying to move around more, which is generally a good thing, but it also comes with enemies having just incredible accuracy with ranged attacks. And they also changed it to where enemies will react to you trying to get behind them for a backstab now. But the problem is this also seems to have sort of changed out of combat, so to speak, backstabs as well, where you can go into sneak mode and try to hit enemies from behind, except the way it is now, enemies almost always auto-detect you once you get into a certain range, sneaking or not. So straight away, while I will get into stuff I enjoy and what they changed here, the combat and the changes they've made I don't think feel particularly great, to the point that I kind of enjoyed it in the prior version. So I think they still clearly have some tweaking to do here. But I'd say the main thing is just that it seems like it's ramping up too fast at the moment. But obviously that kind of thing is going to be a bit subjective. So let's talk about the other stuff. As I mentioned, they added some more to the main story. I obviously don't want to spoil this, but if you had gotten to the end of what was currently available previously, they have added on to that, which of course has to do with the plague that is slowly destroying everything, and we as a serum are here to fight it specifically, and everything else is kind of in service of that. So if you want to see more of that, it is now available. In a somewhat related note, they also added a hardcore mode. Hardcore mode is obviously a single life. If you die, you die, but the catch here is that you can continue to play if you die on hardcore mode. You just can't actually play on hardcore mode at that point. It'll let you keep your character if you were really invested in them. They just are disqualified from being on a hardcore server at that point. And given the balancing that I mentioned, I think the game still needs, it's not really the kind of thing I would enjoy at this moment currently. Now, along with the new story and everything, though, that does come with new areas. Two in particular, the Lowland Meadows and the Marin Woods. Each of these, of course, comes with their own aesthetic and unique mechanics, like this giant fleshy thing you have to destroy with spores to get access to the areas around it. And honestly, it's just nice to see something a little more brightly colored and less dreary, as most of this game is in fact a little dreary. Now, along the way, I didn't quite get here myself, but there will be a new Marin Village, which is a new area that we can go to, of course, hit up the typical town services like we see in the main town of Sacrament. This means new vendors and stuff, of course, but also the ability to get new houses. So in addition to setting up a hub in Sacrament, we could theoretically do that in Marin Village now as well. Though I suppose just to keep things even, they actually also added a new house you could buy in Sacrament as well, but it still works largely the same. Speaking of vendors and town hubs, though, they did make some changes to vendors in general. I would say the main one is that they are limited now in the items they can sell per day, so you can't just blindly buy everything at once. And they were a little vague about what else the actual changes to vendors were, but there were clearly some changes. Now, once you've cleared out some of that content, you might just find yourself engaging with the new Plague system, which is available after you complete the new Breach content or the main story content, because it is meant to be, of course, the actual plague that we are here to stop. Gameplay-wise, however, essentially what this is that it can infect given areas you've been to, and you can then go there to combat it by, of course, killing everything that moves. You can spend items at the various bonfires where you would normally cook food to instead increase the challenge for increased rewards, but in order to clear the objective, we need to kill a certain amount of enemies there and then kill the boss that spawns. So this, in addition to that sort of roguelike mode that they added previously in their first major update, this kind of forms the bulk of what you can do in the end game, so to speak. Talking about in-game, though, of course, facilitates talks about gear itself. So one thing they changed here that I thought was pretty major is they changed weapon scaling to, instead of being additive, be multiplicative, meaning that damage is typically working off of the actual damage of the weapon you're using, plus whatever your stats are that are affected by the scaling of that weapon. As in typical Souls-like fashion, we increase various attributes and stuff as we level up, and some of those, of course, scale different weapons accordingly in terms of damage. That used to simply be additive, meaning that good weapons, even if you didn't have a good scaling stat, would still just be good weapons, whereas that is still the case now. With the change from additive to multiplicative, weapons that you do have attributes that affect weapon scaling should be substantially stronger. Then, of course, there is the wands and gauntlets. These are pretty straightforward. They are what you'd expect, though the gauntlets and the slight reworks to some of the hand-to-hand stuff does facilitate a more pugilistic style of gameplay that wasn't quite as available previously. Wands, of course, being a more mid-range option. Now, they did also rework shields here as well. There are, of course, a few different types of shields, and they have been reworked to affect enemies' pose damage when they hit you. So, in theory, if you're properly blocking with a shield, you can inflict pose damage, but you're also taking it as you're getting hit. But generally speaking, because of the block function and how this affects enemies now, shields are a bit more useful if you want to turtle up. Talking weapons in combat, however, they added what they're calling a hunger mechanic, though it doesn't quite work the way you'd think. So previously, you would activate food items to heal in combat, but then you'd have to wait for a short cooldown period before you could use them again. Well, here they're switching to a sort of charge system where you are allowed to eat so many times per combat in order to increase your health. So it starts off as 5, and then you can upgrade that over the course of the game, which should prevent you from infinitely healing in a given fight, but I will say, given that you have to pretty much scrounge up your own food and everything for fights or cook it yourself even half the time, it does feel kind of necessary to actually stop what you're doing and go scrounge that stuff up so you have the charges to make use of in the first place, but that's not that different from the original version anyway, as if anything, it caused you to use more food. But nonetheless, that's a thing now. And they also reworked the dodge mechanic, which unfortunately included a change that I was not a fan of. Now, your basic dodge actually has more iframes, that is to say, the lowest version of the weighted dodges. So in this game you can be sort of light, medium, or heavy in terms of your equipment load. Light being a quick step. That step has more iframes now. Medium, however, got nerfed pretty hard because its iframes no longer cover the entire animation, which means you get hit at the end of it, which is one of the reasons I was struggling with that boss that I mentioned at the beginning of the game. Not a fan of that change. Now, heavy seems to remain unchanged in the sense that if you have a heavy equipment load, you can do a sort of shoulder lunge thing that is, let's be honest, less than useful comparatively. But to coincide with some of those changes to dodging, they actually also did balance out the way armor works, especially for cloth and leather, making them worthwhile to actually use, whereas they kind of weren't previously. So there's that. Now, just about everything else is a little more complicated and affects balancing. So, for starters, they did make a few changes to the various projects you could take part in to upgrade Sacrament. As an example, one of the things you can upgrade now is the workers, so this way you can speed up the process, which is normally time-gated by waiting for a timer to tick down quite literally. That can be upgraded to be removed, and the Seneschal will actually be able to instantly complete these projects at the cost of a resource. So, as they mentioned in their prior update, I believe it was called Wicked Inside, they talked about how this was still going through iteration and likely wasn't the last version of this that we'll see, but just keep that in mind, I suppose. They did make it a little better than it was. But as for the balance changes and stuff like that, worth a mention that all weapons will come with 4 rune slots. What this means is that weapons weapons and stuff come with abilities or runes typically, and you can slot runes into a weapon to customize not only the weapon you're using, but then the abilities that weapon can use via the focus you build up in combat. You didn't always have the max amount available, whereas now you do. Probably worth a mention that they also overhauled the rune system, adding and changing a bunch as well, too many to mention, frankly, with just about everything else I haven't mentioned being things about just general balancing, changes to individual bosses, or even just some general quality of life stuff, smaller stuff like for instance making certain experience potions small, medium, or large, increasing the amount of experience gained over that period of time, that kind of thing. But I think that's just about where I want to start wrapping up this particular video. And kind of general thoughts-wise for this one, I would say that while a lot of it is great, the new content, of course, the new zones, the new enemies, that kind of stuff, it's also clear that it still needs some time in the oven, which obviously isn't much of a surprise given its early access nature, and for me, at least, it's not quite there, especially with the way the difficulty curve is currently, because even just outside of what I mentioned, just a more general thing that doesn't have to do with this update specifically is like the enchantment systems, which technically speaking they changed as well, but they still feel basically useless, which is why I kind of phrased it that way, because enchantments come with positives and a negative, and that negative just happens to be really strong, which means at least here in the early and mid-game, those items are essentially useless because the drawback is so substantial you can't make use of the good thing. So even just discounting things like enemies and the changes they've made there, I also think some of these systems need balancing as well still. So to that end, as a sort of update here, the Breach is a huge step in the right direction, especially given how slow things have been moving, so they could put this update together. And for me at least, in its current state, this game still just isn't quite fully coming together. And so I would at least say that if you've been waiting on this game to improve across its early access period, I would probably just continue to do so. But it is, again, moving in the right direction, and I am hoping they'll kind of get there in the end. But for today, I think that's pretty much going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.